You're welcome back to Business Week on Rise News. Now, Russia's recent decision to pull out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, allowing Ukrainian wheat shipments through the Black Sea, threatens to disrupt food supply to the developing world, including Africa, and showing just how much global trade impacts the continent. Trade is an essential driver of economic transformation, growth, and prosperity, and informed deliberations on Africa's trade policy need not just be an activity for experts alone, because trade affects the lives of ordinary Africans, shapes development outcomes, and impacts the continent's aspirations for economic transformation. So we're honored to have on the show with us today Ambassador Yonov Agah. He's the Chief Trade Negotiator and Director General of the Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiations, a role he was appointed to in 2021. Before that, Ambassador Agah served as a Deputy DG at the World Trade Organization in Geneva and was also Nigeria's ambassador to the WTO from 2005 to 2013. He served as the Alternative Chief Negotiator for the Doha Round and head of Nigeria's Trade Office to the WTO in the United Nations office at Geneva. Great to have you with us on the show this morning, Ambassador. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Rolake. Thank you for having me.
So, Ambassador, my first question to you is around the Doha Round, which obviously was launched more than a decade ago, almost 2 decades ago, actually. It had an ambitious program around reforming agriculture and tariffs on goods, and was hoping to provide developing countries with flexibilities around the policy space. Members have been divided for years on this, and we haven't really reached a solution. Is it time for African countries to move on and focus on other initiatives to advance their interests? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I don't think African countries can move on. You may ask yourself, move on to where? To what? The challenges we have with the Doha Round is the fact that after the Uruguay round, we had a built-in agenda. Article 20 of the Agreement on Agriculture foresaw further negotiations. And services was also a progressive liberalization agenda that was to start in 2000. However, many of the developed countries thought about balancing the negotiating basket, believing that agriculture alone and services were not enough for the negotiations. So you must have in mind that developing countries resisted the idea of a new round. They just wanted to continue with the built-in agenda. So the problems we have today date back to the challenges that we have had with agriculture. But progress has been made, even in agriculture. At least the export competition pillar has been resolved. Issues relating to tariff rate quotas have been resolved. The main stumbling block remains domestic support in agriculture. And I believe in the new work program, some of these elements will also be addressed. So we don't need to move anywhere. We need to stay around the table. We need to make our voices heard. We need to make sure that we have a better multilateral trading system that supports development in Africa and the rest of the world.
Yeah, and Ambassador Agah, I'm glad that you refer to a multilateral trading system, because if some observers were assessing the WTO, some would ask whether it still remains relevant into the future. And what do I mean? We're seeing a lot more bilateral and in some cases unilateral moves by countries like the US and economic blocs like the EU as perhaps spelling the end of multilateralism that WTO is trying to champion. Is this a strategy that perhaps African countries like Nigeria and others can actually pursue so that it's a combination of multilateralism and other bilateral agreements? And do you think it means that the world is essentially pivoting to a new global trade architecture?
Well, you see, the WTO and the GATT before it were creations of necessity, given the harsh experiences that countries had with the depression of the 30s, the Second World War, and the need for world peace and cooperation. So it's a child of necessity. I dare say that even if you say today there is no WTO, you will have to reinvent something like WTO. So fixing it should be the agenda. And in doing this, I think we have to recognize that the WTO itself is not against plurilateral or bilateral agreements. The WTO itself also allows for room for members to take certain actions. The only thing is the weakening of the enforcement part, the dispute settlement part, where if a member violates the agreement, you have a two-tiered system of adjudication. Part of the problem with that system now is the blockage of the appointment of the appellate court judges by the United States against the wishes of all the other members. So there won't be too much change. You could have the bilaterals, you could have plurilaterals, because even in the WTO, you have plurilateral agreements like aircraft, the trade in civil aircraft, the dairy products, international telecommunications, all these are plurilaterals. The only challenge for the membership is that these plurilaterals are focused on market access, whereas some of the current attempts to create plurilaterals focus on rules. And that's where there's a disconnect.
Of course.
So if you negotiate rules outside the WTO, how do you bring them into the WTO when the rest of the members were not part of the negotiations?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Thanks for juxtaposing those two issues. Now, I have to ask a bit about Africa and how Africa can amplify its voice at the negotiating table. You know, historically, these rules have been seen as a one-size-fits-all. Now, I'm wondering whether it is time for a special dispensation for African countries, especially because Africa's external trade only constitutes about 2.3% of its total trade. So any special arrangement should not, at least on the face of it, jeopardize global trade stability. What are your thoughts on perhaps such an approach for African countries?
Well, I will not agree with you that WTO rules are about one size fits all. I think that's not a good evaluation of the system, the way the system works. WTO rules are designed in such a way that each member binds himself, ties himself to follow a particular pattern of behavior in an area. But at the same time, as soon as you have the commitment, the same rules now provide for what you will do when you run into trouble. And the same rules also recognize what you call special and differential treatment, taking into account that the development needs and the aspirations of all members are not the same. So it's not a one-size-fits-all for everybody. I think the challenge for Africa and many other developing parts of the world is understanding these rules and seeing how you can chart your development policy, trade policy around those rules, taking advantage of where opportunities exist for you to expand your trade while also defending your interests in terms of protection of domestic industries and disruptions of your trade in terms of defensive measures by other members or subsidies that some members provide to their companies or certain anti-trade practices like anti-dumping by some companies. So these are the challenges that we face. But for Africa, I think we are at the table. The recent discussion on WTO reform, the African group in Geneva has submitted a very comprehensive proposal on different elements that, if taken on board, can give rise to a better multilateral trading system.
Yes, indeed. We've been seeing quite a lot of activity from African governments and states and regions at the trade table. So I want to ask you now a bit on Nigeria. Looking at where Nigeria is, two questions I want to pose is, what are Nigeria's priorities at the global trade table, if you like? That's the first part of it. And the second part of it is really around how you see the macroeconomic environment perhaps shaping how Nigeria approaches those negotiations at the global trade table. And those macroeconomic drivers, we know all too well some of the issues we face here domestically, the exchange rate, the subsidy removal, the food supply crisis, etc. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think you have said it all. The Nigerian economy, like the global economy and many developing countries, is under a very difficult stress based on the multiple layers of crisis, which you have referred to. But I think if we have to be rational in terms of how we think, it's a very simple way. We all know that trade is the engine of growth and development. We know that growth is good for the poor. And if we want to look at the level of poverty in Nigeria today, trade should be seen as part of the solution. So the question for Nigeria, either in terms of trade negotiations or in terms of domestic policy, is how do you ensure externally a favorable environment for your products, good market access conditions that you can expand your trade? Domestically, how do you put in place policies that are trade enabling, that enable you to take advantage of the opportunities that are being created? And it's not, there's no silver bullet. Each area, each sector has to be based on the specific circumstances of the country. And this is because trade policy itself is not a standalone. Trade policy is a combination of microeconomic policies. So at the national level, one would want to see great cooperation and working together between the ministers of finance, budget and national planning, and trade. So that in a way, you will now mainstream trade into our development strategies. You will make sure that trade leads every discussion. If we are looking at education, the curriculum must focus on skills in those sectors that Nigeria wants to participate. You are just having a discussion on digital trade and artificial intelligence, things like that. If the president has created a new minister of the marine and blue economy, what are the characteristics of that economy that helps us to harness our ocean resources for development? There may be no skills for now, but the education must focus on that. We also need to look at issues of transfer of technology. The challenge for us now is not just that of catch-up and growth and poverty alleviation. It's also to be able to do this in an environmentally sustainable manner, taking into account the climate challenges that everybody is facing today. So taking all this together, I think one of the things the country needs to do, which we are trying to do, is to get a trade integration study which maps out where you are across all sectors, looks at opportunities in the international market, looks at areas where you can focus your negotiations, countries that you can focus as trading partners, and at the end of the day, the development plans and strategies that will now bring us all together in making trade an engine of growth for the Nigerian economy.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. We look forward to hearing about that study. Now, I want to ask about an issue that has been, two issues that have been juxtaposed, which is Nigeria running a current account surplus, which might imply a devaluation of the currency to boost export revenues. So do you think the policy of pursuing a growth in export revenues may be at odds with the imperatives that drive the management of the exchange rate domestically? Of course, the government wants to stabilize the naira and prevent a free fall of the naira, but at the same time, it wants to boost exports to generate more revenues, including dollar revenues. How can they manage what is, on the face of it, a trade-off of such magnitude?
Well, I'm not sure, from an economic point of view, I'm not sure if there's really a trade-off. Our balance, our current account has always been in surplus. The challenge for us has been on the capital account in terms of the transfers. So, but devaluation itself for Nigeria is not the issue. It is the stability in the exchange rate that I think should be the issue. This is because the oil we sell, the price is in dollar. The cocoa that we will sell, the price is in dollar. So if you devalue the naira, there's no direct linkage in making your exports cheaper.
Right.
I think that's what we need to appreciate. So if our exports were naira denominated, like China, US, or Japan, the devaluation policy will help you by making your exports cheaper and making imports more expensive. But in our case, it's different. I think it's the reverse. So what we actually need is how can we have some stability in the exchange rate so that the fluctuations do not affect business? How do we, instead of always looking at the demand side of limiting the use of dollar or sharing or rationing of the dollar by the forex, by the central bank, how do we now begin to look at generating revenue? Where can the next dollar be made for the Nigerian economy? I think that should be the conversation.
Yes.
Otherwise, the central bank will limit the number of institutions that trade, that do foreign exchange, limit the products that qualify for foreign exchange. Once you begin to put in these restrictions, the market is not fair. So can we allow, in the current regime, allow any bank, any business that can bring in foreign exchange and sell, do the same thing, do that, and while the central bank now intervenes by managing the margins within which this trade can take place?
Yeah. Yeah, so Ambassador, of course, Nigeria doesn't...
Because the supply side for me is the key area to go, not how you manage the available resources through restrictions.
Indeed. And actually, on the supply side, Nigeria doesn't only trade with the world, per se, it trades with Africa. And recent statistics from the NBS show that Nigeria has still underperformed in terms of its intra-Africa trade. Of course, we know there's the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Some would say we came a bit late to the party. Some countries are already moving on the general trading platforms within the region. So what can we do more to boost our participation, especially because research has shown that intra-Africa trade is actually more diversified for countries like Nigeria than its trade with the rest of the world? What more can Nigeria do within the confines of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement?
Well, I would want to propose that from a trade policy point of view, the government needs to have some carefully thought through interventions to enhance productive capacity. You can't sell what you don't produce. So if you look at manufactured exports in Nigeria, for example, since the structural adjustment program, manufacturing has been on a downslide. A lot of the companies need a technological upgrade. What facilities are available for them? The government needs to fashion out which sectors will contribute most to economic growth and recovery. So if you look at apparel, textile and apparel, this is a huge employment area for the youth. So why don't we now start a program of intervention, of creating apparel units, training people in apparel and textiles, trying to get our textile companies back. With the rules of origin under the AFCFTA automotive sector, why will you not be looking at getting our batteries factories back, getting the glass factories back, adding value to our leather as seats, car seats, and things like that. These are very practical things because you can pick a sector, know what is wrong, know the trade opportunity, support the right technology, get the right quality, get the right factory size, and export.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. Just one more thought for you.
It's not going to happen in a vacuum.
Indeed, it wouldn't happen in a vacuum, and I think those words were very well received. Just one more thought, Ambassador. Next week, we have the G20 ministers meeting, the trade ministers meeting. Of course, South Africa is the only Africa country represented there. How can we actually get our priorities on the agenda in a setting like that, and what are your expectations? Very briefly, Ambassador, because we've run out of time.
Yeah, South Africa is there representing Africa, if I remember correctly. Initially, that was the configuration. And prior to that, when we were in Geneva, we used to hold consultative meetings in shaping the agenda. I hope that continues so that South Africa doesn't get into the room and think only of itself, but speaks for Africa. That is the first expectation one would have. The second is the disconnect between the outcomes or discussions in the G20 framework and what happens outside the G20. So if members commit themselves to certain things in the outcome documents of the G20, and then their governments, representatives, particularly in support to WTO and multilateral trade reform, you see a different thing. I think that doesn't help the world economy. We need to see the actions, whatever they decide, translated into actions which will now create confidence in the world economy and at least stimulate new areas of growth.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yonov Fred Agah, DG of the Nigeria Trade Office and also Nigeria's Chief Trade Negotiator, for joining us on the show today to share your insights on Nigeria in the global and African trade context. Thank you very much, sir.